How you doing? Yeah, I just want to elaborate on when Jesus was asked for the signs and wonders, and he said nothing but the sign of Jonah. And Zacchaeus spoke to you with regard to 3 days and 3 nights. And you kind of said, part of the day of Friday, part of the day of Saturday, and that's 3 days. I know Zacchaeus pushed you on that, saying, for example, he wasn't put in the earth until a Saturday. But what I want to understand is the three nights. Where are the 3 nights? If he was putting on Friday, and so it's Friday night, Saturday night, there's no Sunday night because it was Sunday morning when he was gone. So how do you understand that prophecy where Jesus made that claim that he would be in the belly of the earth for 3 days and 3 nights? How do you reconcile that with the gospel narratives?
The gospel writers themselves quite obviously did not have the confusion that has been introduced by words written 600 years later, 600 miles away. They show absolutely no embarrassment about this. They're very clear. They talk about Friday, they talk about Sunday, they use the words that identify these things. They have no issues with it. So they recognize when Jesus is talking about 3 days and 3 nights, he's talking about truly being dead and truly being buried. He's not talking about chronological accuracy. People back then utilized temporal phraseology in a very different way than we do with iPads and iPhones and atomic clocks and things like that. This is very, very easily understood. By the way, Jonah says in the book of Jonah, Jonah says in the book of Jonah that he descended down into Sheol. I think Jonah was dead, and that's the connection. And that hence when he comes forth, he's been made alive. So the connection's very clear. He says he went down to Sheol. What is Sheol? Sheol's the realm of the dead. So I know there are many people who've prefer the idea of somehow being in the belly of a fish, breathing somehow. I'm not sure how that tank of oxygen got in there, but it seems much more that he said he went down to Sheol, and that would be the connection. The point is that Jesus prophesied his own resurrection, and that he had to have died in that process. So no one was confused about that. Well, now we're going to get into debating and argumentation if we're going to do that. Yeah.
Just
Well, the prophecy says alive in the belly of the earth, not dead.
Where?
okay.
He went down alive.
First off, Dr. White said that they would have known what they were saying. Why is it in the plural? The only person who said the 3 days and 3 nights was Matthew, nobody else. Matthew's the same anonymous author that had Jesus riding into Jerusalem on 2 donkeys. Now, was Jonah alive? Everybody knows Jonah was alive. Here's Matthew Henry's commentary. Observe when Jonah prayed, when he was in trouble under the tokens of God's displeasure against him for sin. When we are in affliction, we must pray. Being kept alive by miracle, he prayed. You don't understand the feeling when Christians have to reinterpret clear texts just to try to get around the objections Muslims raise. David used the same language as Jonah in the Psalms that I quoted, because in Hebrew language, coming close to dying and surviving, as my opening statement made clear, like Isaac, is a form of metaphorical death and resurrection. Even Prophet Muhammad, on whom be peace, when he used to wake up, he used to say, praise Allah for raising me alive after I died. And the 3 days and 3 nights, Jesus was putting on what Jews call Saturday night, night of the Sabbath. So Saturday, Sunday, even if you take the full day, it's still 2 days. Clear-cut error. Now Christians have a choice. Either Jesus is a false prophet who died for your sins, or what the gospel writers are trying to put on the tongues of Jesus and is not always accurate. And regarding Psalms chapter 22, my question still remains, if this text read, they pierced my hands and feet, all these other proof texts that the New Testament quotes, and the clearest one, Matthew looked at this and said, this is the clearest text I got, but I don't feel like this is important enough for me to write in the New Testament to prove to Jews that Jesus must be crucified. That does not make sense at all. The only reason Matthew didn't quote this is because the text didn't exist in the form that the Christians forged it. It does not say pierced, as I proved. In order to get the word dog, they have to take a letter out the word, and the very manuscript that Dr. White alluded to has the word, the letter Aleph in it, which means it's supposed to Jewish understanding of Ka'ari. It's only that the Yod got elongated into a Vav, but the word's still the same word. Otherwise, Ka'aru doesn't mean nothing in Hebrew.
Thank you, James and Zakir. I was just wondering, Zakir, how we can reconcile the Mark 15 passage where it talks about Simon of Cyrene, because it says they forced a man coming from the country who was passing by to carry Jesus' cross, when it's talking about Simon. So presumably that means that the Roman soldiers, because that's who they're talking about when they're saying they, forced Simon to do this. So then they forced Simon to die. So the Roman soldiers act in contradiction to Pilate, because there's no kind of doubt about who it is right there. But in Surah 4:157, it seems that it is made to appear to them that it is Jesus who died. And so both things, it seems, cannot be true. And so, yeah, I was wondering how you reconcile those.
Okay, early Christians who have proven from the internal evidence, the same internal evidence that James gets the dating of the Gospels from, that there were people claiming that Simon of Cyrene was killed on the cross instead of Jesus before John, and John was trying to react to the story. Now, regarding the Romans putting Simon on the cross, as Basilides said, and Basilides is not a Docetist, by the way, I'll quote scholars if Dr. White tries to say otherwise, he mentioned that Jesus' likeness went unto Simon of Cyrene, and Simon of Cyrene's likeness went unto him, and that's how the Romans got confused. And even church fathers such as Tertullian, they used to believe that one of the miracles of Jesus is that he could change form, and that they got that from the Gospels itself. On many occasions, the Jews picked up stones to stone Jesus. Do you think they were chasing him down the street, or miraculously God was protecting him with this miracle? Tertullian even believed Jesus changed form. Not only that, Surah 5, Ayah 110, God says to Jesus on the day of judgment, one of his favors to Jesus is that I withheld the hand of the children of Israel from you. Now, if anybody asks, it was the Romans who killed Jesus, not the Jews. According to the Gospels, the Jews are the one who forced Pilate to kill Jesus. So the Romans were the tools. According to the Gospels, the Jews were the one who done it. So the blame would be on them and their children, as Matthew claims. So the Quran is very, very clear. And when Dr. White says 40 Arabic words, which are backed up by the Psalms, as Sidney Griffith points out in his book, The Bible in Arabic, the Quran is a reminder. It assumes knowledge on the part of its audience, so the lay Christians may not understand, but the learned Christians in the 7th century who knew the history of the so-called heretics who, with the substitution theory, and knew the evidence in the gospel, they would know what the Quran's alluding to. That's why the Quran doesn't have to go into so much detail regarding the topic.
The Quran most definitely does assume the biblical narrative. And in that process, if you accept the radical argumentation, and it is radical, the people that Zakir is quoting are radical liberals. Mythicists, people who believe Jesus didn't exist. Quoted somebody from the University of Pretoria just a few moments ago, part of the Jesus seminar. We're talking about, these are people who vote about what Jesus said by dropping marbles in bags, okay? This is just, for me as a Christian, it's clear evidence that I could use the wildest Orientalists and you would have to accept every word that I say because you're using the wildest people on the left fringe to come up with your arguments tonight. And I hope that'll end someday. I'm looking forward to the day when the conversation we have about this will be with Muslims using believing sources that are consistent with their own defenses of the Quran, rather than using Dr. Price, who's a nice guy, but he's so far out there that even the citation of him would be like, think of the wildest critic of the Quran that I could possibly quote as far out there as possible. If I was basing all my stuff upon that, that'd be the same type of thing that we're dealing with here. And so when I read Mark chapter 15, there is a phrase here, and I'll just give it to you very quickly. Hina aretan staran autu. Now, I'm not going to ask if you read Greek, but when you read this text, ton staran autu, the only way, if you're reading carefully, is that this is Jesus's cross. So the autons and the autos of verses 22 and 23 are referring back to Jesus. Now, if you're not reading carefully, I suppose you might get confused, but there's no reason to. And folks, I can misread the Quran pretty easily as well if you want me to. But misreading a text is not the same thing as convicting the text of having been changed or altered. The reality is Mark and Matthew and all say the same thing. Jesus was crucified. Trying to change that basic reality just simply doesn't work. I even have the large print. You can read that from 10 feet away.
Sorry. According to Hebrews,
Attacked by the guy down there.
well, according to Hebrews chapter 10, verse number 10 to 18, we find very clearly Paul.
I'm sorry, chapter 10, what?
10, Hebrews chapter 10, verse number 10 to 18.
Oh, 10 through 18.
10 to 18, where Paul is saying that normal.
I don't think Paul wrote it.
Well, okay, well, Hebrews is telling us anyway
Right.
that if he didn't write it, who wrote it then?
You want my quick theory?
Please.
Just really, really fast.
Before I go to my main question.
I think it's a sermon
Okay.
that Paul preached in Hebrew
Okay.
that Luke wrote down in Greek
Okay.
because it's Luke's grammar and vocabulary.
Okay. Well, according to Luke, in Hebrews chapter 10, verse number 10 to 18, he says, no more sin offering is required because Jesus was the ultimate sacrifice. But when we find in Acts, when Paul went to Jerusalem, James, who was the brother of Jesus, obviously if Jesus came to die for their sin, then they know that there would be no more sin sacrifice needed. But James is actually telling Paul to go and sacrifice animals because there were 4 men who were under a Nazarite vow.
Nazarite.
That's right. Now, if you read Numbers chapter 6, verse number 13, it will tell you what a Nazarite vow is, and that consists of burnt offering, sin offering, and peace offering. And we know then that Paul actively took part in this in this ritual, which consisted of sin offering. Now, if Hebrews is telling us that no more sin offering is needed, and then why is it that James, who sat, ate, walked, talked with Jesus, where Paul never met Jesus, why are they still offering sin offering when clearly no more should be done because Jesus paid for the ultimate sacrifice? Thank you.
The Nazarite vow is the issue here, and obviously in Jerusalem, the Jewish Christians, especially, we're told in the book of Acts, there were many who were former priests, continued to do many of the things that identified them as the Jewish people. They did not, the separation that took place between the synagogue and the church, while inevitable, has in many ways been tragic. It led to many of the acts of anti-Semitism during the medieval period, and how it happened, it may have had to have happened over time, but how it happened is rather tragic. But what you do see in the book of Acts is a transition period, even in Peter. Peter hears from Jesus to not call any, he saw, for example, how he treated the Syrophoenician woman. And yet what does God have to do with Peter? I'm not sure how long it is after the resurrection. He has to give him a vision 3 times, slap him upside the head, before he finally gets the idea, I shouldn't call what God has called unclean clean. Okay, so let's say it was a full decade. Traditions die hard, and what we see in James and what we see in the church in Jerusalem is that transitionary period. And I don't know about you, but I would have had a hard time letting go of the traditions that I was raised with as a young person, even in the light of what Jesus taught. So I think there's a clear transition period that you see in the book of Acts. And by the end of the book of Acts, what you have is the normative functioning of the church. Whereas in the beginning you have, well, I haven't seen anybody struck dead in a deacon's meeting recently. So Acts chapter 5 and Ananias and Sapphira. We could use it, but it hasn't happened recently. So I see it as a transitionary issue.
Even though it's 30 years after.
Oh yeah, I think it 30 years?
30 years after.
I'm not sure. I'm not sure of the chronology on exactly when that would be, but it's very clearly in Jerusalem. There continued to be, before the destruction of the temple, those people that stuck very closely to their Jewish identity, and I would see the Nazarite vow as a part of that element of it. Did they reinterpret the offerings in the light of what Jesus did? We're not told. We're not told. Oh, he's not going to miss a chance to talk real fast.
Okay. This proves exactly what I've been saying all along. The Old Testament does not teach that the Messiah will die for the sins of the world, and the disciples of Jesus never preached this and refuted Paul on this. In fact, according to James Dunn, who quotes John Dominic Crossan, who Dr. James White himself quoted, John Dominic Crossan, he believed that James set up Paul in Jerusalem because they had found out that Paul was teaching this doctrine of the Torah being abrogated. So they made him, in front of everybody, demonstrate he still follows the law of Moses. But not only that, out of everything James and the Jerusalem disciples could have done to expose Paul, they made him do a sin offering, which abolishes everything Paul's been saying about the cross. Why would they still be sacrificing when Jesus is the sacrifice to end all sacrifices? According to the book of Ezekiel, chapter 45, in the Messianic age, the Messiah will sacrifice an animal for his own sin and for the sins of his followers. He's referred to as the prince in Ezekiel 45. And just in case Dr. White tries to say that that's not talking about the Messiah, John Gill says it's about the Messiah, and Dr. Michael Brand, Dr. White's colleague, admits it's about the Messiah. So normally Christians, they quote from the Quran, look, Muhammad has to ask for forgiveness for his own sins. Look, Jesus is sinless. But then we find in Mark chapter 1, Jesus is baptized for the forgiveness of sins, and Matthew omits it. And then in the Messianic age, he will still be doing animal sacrifices. How does that go with the cross? Regarding Paul's action in Acts 21, which proves what I said, that Paul says, to a Jew I act like a Jew, and to one not under the law, which means pagans, I act like one not under the law, I act like a pagan, which is why when the disciples said that Jesus died and resurrected in an Israelite sense, he turned it into a mystery religion sense. This is what the Interpreter's Bible says about Acts. Here the author of Acts makes Paul guilty of an act of insincerity to which he would never in reality have condescended. In reply, it must be said that if Acts gives a true picture, then we must admit a certain disingenuousness in Paul's conduct. It says further, thus it is not the performance of the rite in itself that causes difficulty, it was rather the fact that it was done with an ulterior motive to suggest something that was not strictly true. Could Paul do this without hypocrisy? Proves my opening statement. The disciples were Muslims who believed the Psalms, and Paul came and took what they said, distorted it into a Gentile pagan culture. And what does the Quran say in Surah 3, Ayah 78? It accuses the people of the book of distorting with their tongues and interpretations. Paul's a perfect example of this.
Thank you. My question is for Zakir Hussain. If Jesus was crucified, what evidence would you expect to see from the first century that we don't have? So it seems like everything that we would expect to be true if he was crucified is true. So what would you expect that's missing?
The first thing I want to clear up before I answer this question, that with all due respect, Dr. White's methodology is flawed, because he doesn't realize that him and Robert Price, for example, are two extremes. Robert Price finds the evidence for Jesus so flimsy that he denies the existence of Jesus, and he contradicts Islam, so why can't I quote him? Or why should I agree with anything he says? But then Dr. White is at the other end of the spectrum, that everything said about Jesus in the first century in the Gospels is all historical. That also contradicts Islam. So if I should reject everything Robert Price says, then I should reject everything you say. Why not be in the middle ground and weigh each evidence? Then regarding what I would need to believe Jesus was crucified, number one, the Psalms would have to make it clear, the Hebrew Bible would have to make it clear that the Messiah would die. The New Testament should have a consistent narrative, and there shouldn't be no early Christians denying the crucifixion. And of course, the Quran, which is the word of God, proven beyond doubt, should not deny it. Also, Dr. White says, but I can quote liberals and whoever and launch arguments against Islam. But with all due respect, Dr. White, the difference between us is if you do launch the arguments, it'll actually get refuted, unlike half the things I brought up tonight, with all due respect.
I'm a little surprised by what I just heard, because the answer to the question was, Well, I would expect that the Psalms would teach us. Well, every Psalm that has been brought up, once you recognize that it is inappropriate to say, well, you can't go beyond what the psalmist says. Once we realize Jesus did that, once we realize all the New Testament writers, it's a convenient thing to say, we just blame Paul. The Quran never does. But we know more about it than the writer of the Quran did. Oh, how'd that happen? That's an interesting fact to point out. None of those passages from the Psalms, and by the way, it's always Psalm 22, not Psalms 22. It's one of my pet peeves, sorry. You'd never say hymns 106. So anyway, every one of those Psalms is consistent with the New Testament interpretation of it. There is a consistent New Testament interpretation. You do not have to introduce all the alleged contradictions and misreadings that Zakir has introduced this evening, which come from a Jewish perspective and not from a Christian perspective. And then when it comes to the Quran, well, let's just be honest. The fundamental reason we're here tonight is because you take that as the lens through which you're reading all these other things. You don't have to read them the way that you've been reading them. You do it because of those 40 Arabic words, which are not clear in what they say. They are not clear in their interpretation. They're not clear where they came from. And I could add all sorts of, I could start going into issues here about, well, how do you know this was originally a part of the Quran? I mean, let's look at the compilation. Let's look at the fact that there were certain verses that weren't even found in the original compilation made under Abu Bakr. Was this one that was, who had memorized this, et cetera, et cetera. We can go into all sorts of issues like that. But I think we've gone late enough into the evening to recognize that the fundamental issue is that when you allow the New Testament to speak in the context in which it was written, and you allow for the fact that the New Testament has an intimate relationship to the Old Testament, that the Quran has to neither one. The Quran has no meaningful intertextual relationship to either the Old or New Testament, none whatsoever. Once you recognize that, then the question really becomes, well, what's the ultimate sources of authority we're using here? And you can come up with all sorts of wild-eyed liberals that will point out any contradiction, any type of religious text you can find. But you will not find consistent people who believe that God has spoken, who will be following each one of these types of arguments. That's the problem this evening. So we have 3 minutes. I think we've done half an hour, haven't we? What is it? It's 10:05. Okay. Okay.
6 minutes left.
Yes,
Thank you. Your shirt's glowing.
Yes, James, do you think, what about deliberate excluding? Jesus has excluded in the church hymns in the prayer to be a messenger of God, according to John 17:3. He's definitely a messenger. He couldn't say no. If you say no, that means you reject John 17 verse 3. Having been entitled to be messenger of God according to Quran, according also his real position at this time, impossible to be crucified, but to be honored and to have more glory. As a messenger, cannot be crucified, can be killed, but as a prophet, can be killed like Jeremiah, like John the Baptist, like Zechariah. But as a messenger, impossible. So Moses never been actually killed by the Pharaonites. Abraham wasn't killed by Babylonians. Elijah was about to be killed by the Phoenician, but also been rose to heaven as Jesus rose, because he is a messenger. And the Quran, in fact, have answered all question of the Christian side. But sadly, Paul have blocked the peaceful transfer of Jewish faith into Christian faith, lastly to Muslim faith. And this Paul problem, not Jesus problem. Thank you.
I'll be perfectly honest with you, I don't know what the question was. There was a lot of stuff there, so one thing that I heard was the common citation of John 17:3. Again, a meaningful exegesis means you listen to everything that a text says. And when you can take one text where Jesus, in addressing the Father, refers to him as the only true God, assume Unitarianism, and then ignore that one sentence later, Jesus says, "Glorify me, Father, with the glory which I shared in your presence before the world was," which refers clearly to the same vision we have in Daniel. We're talking about an eternal being here. This is the same book of John that begins with, in the beginning was the Word, Word was with God, and the Word was God. It ends with John 20:28, Thomas confessing, my Lord and my God. Meaningful exegesis, which, to be honest with you, is what I try to do with the Quran, which is why I don't use a lot of the arguments that many people use against the Quran, because I actually try to read it in its own context. When you do the same thing with the Gospel of John, you might understand why even Bart Ehrman, who is no friend of Christianity, says, well, obviously the Gospel of John presents the deity of Christ. That's what it's all about. It's so apparent and so clear. And what it allows you to do is to recognize that Jesus was a monotheist. He only believed there is one true God, and yet that same book identifies Father, Son, and Holy Spirit as God. That's why Christians believe in the doctrine of the Trinity. I didn't understand the rest of it. I don't understand what Paul has to do with John 17:3 or any of the rest of it. I sort of got lost because I didn't really understand all of it. I apologize. Part of it was because we were eating the microphone and I couldn't understand it really clearly.
John 17:3 is the most difficult text for Trinitarians to explain. Now, Dr. White, notice what Dr. White said, we're assuming Unitarianism, whereas Augustine, who is one of the greatest Trinitarian minds in the history of the church, found John 17 chapter 3 so difficult that he changed the wording of the text. Anyone could check this for themselves. Regarding the next verse, I think it's the verse after, it's verse 5, not the next verse. John 17:5, regarding the glory that I had with you before the world began. If Dr. White takes the statements of Jesus back in the Jewish context, as Anthony Buzzard in his book has rightly pointed out, that is speaking about Jews speaking about the decrees of God. For example, if God has told you by revelation that you're promised a place in heaven, a Jew can say to God, give me that place in heaven that was with me before the earth began. It's talking about God's decree. Not only that, to further prove this point, Raymond Brown points out, Brown may be called a liberal according to Dr. White, but the manuscript that Raymond Brown speaks about is not a liberal manuscript. There's a variant reading in this which doesn't say, which I had before you, before the world began. It says the glory that was with you before the world began. And regarding, folks, sometimes it feels strange to be that a Muslim, as a Muslim, we're seen as the bad guys in this debate of Jesus being crucified, when the whole reason the ayah was brought up in the first place, why does the Quran deny that Jesus was crucified? It wasn't even speaking to Christians in that verse. It was in response to the Jews, because the Jews know, Dr. White said, which Jew would call Jesus a Messiah? Read Mark chapter 15, mocking him on the cross. They say, let this Messiah get himself down from the cross. By saying we crucified the Messiah Jesus, they're mocking, because in Jewish belief, they cannot kill the Messiah. So it's like saying square circle, crucified Messiah is like square circle. So the Quran is defending Jesus and saying, no, you didn't kill him, he's returning. So we're actually the good guys in this debate, because like Paul said, Jesus has been made a curse for us. The Quran says regarding Jesus that I am blessed wherever I be. We're actually the good guys in this debate, defending Jesus.
Sorry, we'll have just one more question from there, and that's it, yeah?
Okay, I had two questions, but I'll limit it to just the one. My question is that, just in framing my question, I'll say that it's interesting that you talk that the Quran was replying to the Jews in stating that Jesus wasn't crucified. That would also accord with what Josephus said, which was that the Messiah was crucified. So we have Jewish history, also through Tacitus, pagan history, as well as Christian history. But all of those you've addressed. The one which I'm not sure if you addressed it was modern secular historians. Bar-Arman was the most, believe the most common author that you quoted. And despite him being a great skeptic of the Bible, of Christianity, he believes the books contradict itself just as you do. He states that one of the most certain facts of history, not just religious history, but history, was Jesus' crucifixion. This would also accord with what John Dominic Crossan said, also a skeptic, and even what James Dunn said, who you quoted yourself. He said that there's two facts which are certain in Jesus' life, and one of those most certain is Jesus' crucifixion. So without reference to interpreted prophecies from Psalms, which came hundreds and hundreds of years before Jesus, or the Quran, which came hundreds of years after Jesus, on a historical basis. What historical proof is there that Jesus wasn't crucified, but it was someone else, Simon of Cyrene, for instance?
I gave the evidence from your Gospels, and I proved, even with the Raymond Brand quote, and from showing the difference between Mark and John, that John was reacting to Christians who believed Jesus' prayer was heard and that Simon of Cyrene was on the cross. So if you never grasp that point, you can watch the video again and you'll see me address it. I even addressed Bar Ehrman, and you mentioned James Dunn, so I'll mention what James Dunn mentions in his book, Remembering Jesus, I believe it's called off the top of my head. He speaks about the limitations of the historical critical method, and he himself mentions that they cannot, with that method, verify miracles. And if there's a choice between verifying a miracle or going with something that we can see naturalistically, they will always go with a naturalistic option. So if there's two choices, Jesus was saved by God or Jesus died, a historian cannot verify the miracle, which is why they will say that the crucifixion is a fact, but on the same premise that they will deny that Jesus died was saved from the cross through a miracle, is the same reason they would reject the resurrection, because Bar Ehrman even says they cannot verify miracles. So if you got the Psalms making it clear that the Messiah will be saved from dying, his prayer will be answered, and you got these historians saying that he died on the cross, and the Quran confirms that they did not kill him, then I'm going to take the Quran and the words of the prophets over these historians any other day. And also, with all due respect, Dr. White misrepresented Ehrman as well. Ehrman doesn't believe that John teaches that Jesus is Yahweh. Ehrman, in his book, How Jesus Became God, says that John's seeing Jesus as a God, but still under Yahweh, because nowadays we think there's humans and then there's God, and that's it. In the ancient times, there were humans, and then there was these Elohim type of figures in the middle, and then there was Yahweh, the supreme God. So John has brought him up to Elohim, our God, but he hasn't made him on the level of Yahweh yet. That would be later Christians after John. That's Ehrman's position. Thank you very much.
No, it's not his position. I guess you don't keep up with his blog, but he has evolved greatly even since he wrote that book, and now admits that all the gospel writers viewed Jesus as a form of deity. The idea that he denies that Jesus identified as Yahweh. Just last week, someone said that they heard him say something. He may be changing on that. I don't know. I hope so, because it's so obvious that all the New Testament writers did identify Jesus as Yahweh, including John. And that's a very important thing to keep in mind. Once again, what we've heard is a complete dependence on Zakir's part on ultra-liberal theology, on ultra-liberal conclusions. We haven't heard this evening a consistent Islamic argument. We've heard a good Jewish argument, or if you're a naturalistic materialist and an ultra-leftist, you can come up with your arguments. But as far as an actual interaction that would be consistent with the way that you would... If anyone here believes in the Miraj and Isra, you cannot believe what Zakir said this evening. Because the consistent application of the skeptical, shotgun type of attack upon the New Testament we've seen this evening would destroy every element of the supernatural in Muhammad's life. Every bit of it. Gone. You wouldn't find a single person he's quoted tonight that would substantiate your belief in the Miraj and Isra. Not a one. Not a single one. Why? Because of the methodology they use, not because of the facts. Not because of the facts. So I continue looking for that opportunity of, it's interesting, I asked a Muslim friend of mine once, a very erudite, learned young man, if he'd ever debate this subject. And he said, no, I've never debated on it, because Surah 4:1-7 says that it was made to appear to them, therefore all the historical evidence would substantiate that it was made to appear to them. So why should we debate it? And if you take that position, that's a position of faith. If you take the position that says, well, all the history is going to be wrong, that's one thing. To turn around and try to use battery acid on the text of the Bible to substantiate the text of the Quran at this one point, without recognizing that you've had to dip into a barrel that will destroy the Quran as well, is not a wise direction to go. Think about it. I think it's very, very important. Closing statements? 3 minutes, right? And then we let you out of here. Once again, thank you very much for sticking around this late. It is always my tradition, starting when I debated Shabir Ali in 2006, to try to bring something. And I'm going to tell you something, Zakir, I'm going to be really glad to give this to you because I'm sick and tired trying to drag it upstairs because it's a big honking book, which means it's also a big expensive book. But this is a book called From Heaven He Came and Sought Her. It's on the subject of definite atonement. Not sure given all the reading you do, you might find it useful. Someday I may see you with dozens and dozens of photocopies from that you're thumbing through very quickly. There's things called computers, dude. They're really great. So, secondly, despite how sharp our encounter has been here this evening, I want you to understand that when I leave this place, I'm going to pray for this young man. And I hope he doesn't mind that. And I hope you don't mind that. We have disagreed. I disagree so much with Zakir's research methods and everything else. But I pray for him. And I want you to realize I pray for you because the reality is I experience the resurrected Christ each and every day. That doesn't make me right on the history. But I can tell you that what we believe goes back to the earliest sources. And I just want to ask you once again, what if all those prophecies, what if Isaiah 53 is about Jesus? What if a single manuscript here, we just heard about a single textual variant, I couldn't even find it in Nessie Holland. A single text, what if we actually do know what the New Testament text said, and what if it's all true? Did the writer of the Quran know what was in the New Testament? My answer to that is no, he did not. So think about it, consider that, and remember that Jesus Christ, I believe, has always been a perfect Savior to everyone who has ever turned to him in faith. Thank you very much for being here. Thank you for your attention, and thank you, Zakir, for being here this evening, even though I do not understand why the whole evening you've been wearing a jacket. Don't get it. Thank you very much.
I can finally stand up because I don't have to use my papers now. It wasn't my fault. We could have hooked this up to that. My whole approach was supposed to be with a PowerPoint, so I was like fighting one-handed, as they say. Anyway, Dr. White, I really appreciate you coming. A lot of people may not realize it sometimes in the heat of this WWF type of debate. It may look like we don't like each other, but I actually have a lot of respect for Dr. White, and I'm sure he knows that. And I have a book for you too, just so us Muslims don't look cheap.
It's almost as heavy as that one.
Folks, in summary of what we spoke about tonight, I showed that there's a prophecy in the Torah that the Christians claim is about the crucifixion of Jesus. I showed that Isaac was saved, and the language used in Jewish sources was death and resurrection. In fact, the book of Hebrews, chapter 11, I believe it's verse 19, uses the same terminology regarding Isaac. And that's how his disciples used it for him, and Paul went out and distorted it. I showed that before the Gospel of John, there were Christians with the substitution theory, and I gave all my sources. Now, what am I really here for? To disprove that Jesus died on the cross? Yes, that's one of the reasons, but that's secondary. The real reason I'm here is to call everybody to Tawheed. This is the ultimate thing that everybody must know, that God is one person who should be worshipped alone, and he alone has the perfect names and attributes, etc. This is the most important thing. So us Muslims are calling everybody to know that Jesus the Messiah was not a false Messiah. Prophets have died in the past. John the Baptist died. Muslims don't come up here and try to say, was John the Baptist beheaded? Do we do that? Why is it different for Jesus, folks? Because the Psalms make it clear the Messiah cannot die at the hands of his enemies. I did not do no Jewish method, no Australian method. I read what the Psalm said itself. And Dr. White didn't deny the Psalm said this once. Remember that. I showed how Jesus, according to the earliest sources, said it is impossible to die outside Jerusalem. And it's clear, according to Dr. White's own wording, that Jesus died outside Jerusalem. So every time a Christian says Jesus got crucified, you are confirming he is a false Messiah. A crucified Messiah is like a squared circle. That's not what the prophecy said. So Islam, which is the resurrection of Jewish Christianity, the Christianity of the disciples, as the New Jerome Biblical Commentary mentions in Matthew chapter 5, we're doing the same thing that the disciples did. The disciples called up Paul for what he was teaching, and they died out. And with the coming of Prophet Muhammad, on whom be peace, their religion resurrected, and we're doing the same thing. We are the followers of Jesus, like the Jewish Christians, and we're speaking to the other Christians who are the followers of Paul and doing the same thing that James did in Acts 21. Thank you very much, and I hope you enjoyed yourself.
Assalamu alaikum. My name is Vegard and I'm a Norwegian Muslim convert. I'm working with the Dawah organization IslamNet to establish the Deen of Allah here in Norway. We give Dawah and present Islam to the Norwegian people. Isn't that great? To be more efficient in our Dawah, we are establishing a first of its kind Masjid and Dawah Center, where we will have Islamic programs, classes, lectures and education for non-Muslims. I am so grateful to Allah for having guided me to Islam. Sadly, I am the only Muslim in my family. It hurts me that my parents haven't accepted Islam yet, and I ask Allah to guide them. But it also gives me a special drive to work for the establishment of Islam. I don't want anyone to miss the chance of becoming Muslim. Maybe my mom and dad become Muslim one day thanks to you. If we can establish this center, I could bring my parents to come and learn about Islam in our native language, which is a challenge today with the mosque here speaking Somali, Arabic and Urdu. The Prophet ﷺ said that the Muslims are like one body. If you can feel my pain, would you please help me relieve it? You are now my new family. Click the link and donate to establish this masjid and share in the reward for the message of Islam reaching the corners of Norway.